Welcome back to True Stories, where we bring you tales of justice served in unexpected ways. Comment where you're watching from today, and get ready for a story about how one high-stakes poker game changed the balance of power in Las Vegas forever. In the depths of the Crimson Palace Casino, where million-dollar deals were made and broken every night, Vincent Romano sat at his private poker table like a king on his throne. The mob boss had ruled the Vegas underground for 15 years, using the casino's exclusive high roller room as his court. Tonight's game carried a buy-in of $5 million, but the real stakes were much higher than money. The private gaming room smelled of expensive cigars and aged whiskey, its walls lined with deep burgundy wallpaper that seemed to absorb both light and secrets. 6 players had already taken their seats around the green felt table, each one a power player in their own right: corrupt politicians, drug lords, and arms dealers, all paying tribute to Romano through their losses. Romano himself cut an imposing figure in his tailored Italian suit, his silver hair slicked back, heavy rings adorning his fingers like brass knuckles. At 65, he had outlived most of his rivals, not through luck but through a calculated brutality that had earned him both fear and respect in equal measure. The game was about to begin when the door opened one final time. The newcomer wore a simple black suit that somehow managed to look more expensive than Romano's Italian designer wear. His presence filled the room instantly, commanding attention without effort. Jason Statham had arrived. Romano's eyebrows lifted slightly as he watched the action star approach the table. This wasn't part of the plan. The regular players shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing a disturbance in the usual order of things. The mob boss's private games were by invitation only, and everyone knew that Hollywood celebrities weren't on the guest list. "I believe this seat is open," Jason said, his gravelly British accent cutting through the tension. He pulled out the last chair, directly across from Romano, and placed a metal briefcase on the table. Romano's security team moved forward, but their boss held up a hand, stopping them. Something about the stranger's confidence had piqued his curiosity. "This is a private game, Mr. Statham," Romano said, rolling the name around his mouth like a sour candy. "By invitation only." Jason's expression remained neutral as he opened the briefcase, revealing neat stacks of $100 bills. $5 million says I have an invitation." Romano studied the action star with cold eyes that had ordered countless deaths. But Jason met his gaze steadily, showing neither fear nor aggression. Just calm certainty. After a long moment, Romano smiled, though the expression never reached his eyes. "Very well. Let's see if Hollywood's tough guy can play with the big boys." The other players watched the exchange with varying degrees of tension. They all knew Romano didn't allow outsiders into his games without a reason. Either the mob boss was planning something, or he had seriously underestimated his unexpected guest. Either way, blood usually followed such mistakes in judgment. The dealer began shuffling cards with practiced precision as drinks were served. Romano kept his attention on Jason, trying to read something in the action star's impassive features. "Tell me, Mr. Statham, what brings a man like you to my humble game? Surely Hollywood provides enough excitement." Jason picked up his cards, glancing at them briefly before responding. "Let's just say I heard this was where the real action is." His tone was casual, but something in it made Romano's security team exchange glances. They had heard many men try to play it cool at this table. Most of them had later been found in shallow graves in the desert. The first few hands played out in relative silence, each player measuring their opponents. Jason played conservatively, folding more often than not, seemingly content to observe. Romano won several substantial pots, his trademark aggressive style pushing lesser players into mistakes. But Jason remained unruffled, neither intimidated by the mob boss's power plays nor tempted into foolish bets. An hour into the game, Romano decided to test his mysterious guest. During a hand where Jason had finally shown interest, the mob boss began to reminisce. "You know, I've seen all your movies, Mr. Statham. Such violence, such intensity. But this isn't a movie set. There are no stunt doubles here, no second takes." Jason called Romano's bet without hesitation, his expression unchanged. "Life's funny that way, isn't it? Sometimes reality is more interesting than fiction." The mob boss's smile tightened at the subtle challenge in those words. He raised the pot significantly, forcing two other players to fold. Indeed, Romano continued, his voice carrying an edge now. For instance, in real life, people who stick their noses where they don't belong tend to have unfortunate accidents. Just last week, a federal agent got a bit too curious about my business. They still haven't found all the pieces. The threat hung in the air like cigar smoke, but Jason seemed more interested in his cards than Romano's attempts at intimidation. He matched the mob boss's raise and added another million to the pot. Fascinating story. I've got one of my own if you're interested. Romano's eyes narrowed at the action star's continued composure. This wasn't how these conversations usually went. His opponents typically showed fear by now, or at least anxiety. But Jason's calm felt unshakable, as if he were the one in control of the situation. Please, Romano said, gesturing expansively. Enlighten us. He raised again, pushing the pot to nearly $10 million. The other players had long since folded, leaving just the two of them in the hand. Jason matched the bet before speaking. It's about a man who spent 30 years building an empire. Had everyone convinced he was untouchable. Never realized he had a leak right at the top of his organization. Fascinating story, really. Especially the ending. For the first time that evening, Romano's composure slipped slightly. It was barely noticeable, just a tiny muscle twitch near his eye, but in a room full of predators, everyone saw it. The mob boss recovered quickly, but the dynamic had shifted. Suddenly his threats felt hollow, while Jason's presence seemed to grow even more commanding. I'm sure we'd all love to hear how it ends, Romano said, his voice carrying a dangerous undercurrent. He pushed another stack of chips into the pot, bringing the total to $15 million. It was the largest hand he'd ever played in these private games. Jason smiled for the first time that evening, though like Romano's earlier expression, it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, you'll find out soon enough. He called the bet and turned over his cards, revealing a royal flush, the rarest hand in poker. The odds of getting such a hand were over 600,000 to 1. Romano's face darkened as he stared at the cards. In 15 years of running this game, he had never seen a royal flush. The statistical improbability combined with Jason's cryptic words created a moment of perfect tension. Everyone at the table knew they were watching more than just a poker game, but none of them could guess what was really at stake. As Jason reached for the chips, Romano's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist. That's quite a lucky hand, Mr. Statham. Almost too lucky. The mob boss's security team moved closer, hands reaching inside their jackets. But Jason remained perfectly calm, his gaze steady as he met Romano's threatening stare. You know what they say about luck, Mr. Romano, Jason replied quietly. It's when preparation meets opportunity. He gently but firmly removed Romano's hand from his wrist, an act that would have gotten anyone else killed immediately. And I've been preparing for this opportunity for a very long time. The other players began to excuse themselves, sensing that the evening was about to take a dangerous turn. But as they stood to leave, the door to the private room opened again. This time, several men in dark suits entered, men whose bearing and attention to detail marked them as federal agents, though they wore no badges. Romano's security team reached for their weapons, but Jason's voice cut through the tension like a knife. I wouldn't do that if I were you, gentlemen. Unless you want this evening to get unnecessarily messy. Something in his tone made them hesitate, their hands frozen halfway to their guns. The mob boss looked between Jason and the newcomers, his mind racing to understand what was happening. But deep down, he already knew. Somehow, this wasn't just a poker game anymore. It was the beginning of the end, and he had invited it right into his inner sanctum. The private gaming room of the Crimson Palace Casino had become a powder keg, with Vincent Romano and Jason Statham at its center. The mob boss's security team stood frozen, caught between their instinct to protect their employer and the clear warning in Jason's voice. The federal agents who had just entered maintained their positions near the door, professional and alert but making no aggressive moves. Romano's mind raced through possibilities, trying to understand how his carefully controlled domain had been breached. He had vetted everyone in his organization personally, had built his empire on fear and absolute loyalty. Yet here was Jason Statham, action star and apparent federal operative, sitting at his private table with $15 million in winnings and the kind of confidence that only came from holding all the cards, both literally and figuratively. "You're probably wondering how long we've been watching you," Jason said, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "The answer might surprise you." He reached into his jacket, making Romano's men twitch, but pulled out only a small photograph. He slid it across the green felt table. Romano picked up the photo, his face darkening as he recognized it. The image showed him 30 years younger, standing outside a burning building in Chicago. It was the night he had first made his mark in the criminal underworld, eliminating a rival gang in what was officially ruled an electrical fire. No copies of that photo were supposed to exist. "That's impossible," Romano whispered, his usual composure cracking. "I destroyed every copy. I killed everyone who knew about that night." Jason's expression remained neutral, but his eyes held a dangerous glint. "Not everyone, Mr. Romano. You missed one person. The boy who watched his father burn alive in that building. The boy who grew up to become a federal agent, dedicating his life to bringing you down." The mob boss's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, realization, and finally, a hint of fear. "Agent Michael Chen," he said softly. "He disappeared 6 months ago. We found his car in the desert." Jason nodded, his expression hardening. "You found what you were meant to find. But Michael wasn't in that car. He was already deep undercover in your organization, working his way up through the ranks." Romano's mind raced through his personnel, trying to identify the mole. Jason watched the thoughts play across his face and smiled grimly. "Don't bother trying to figure it out. Michael was very good at his job. Good enough to become your most trusted lieutenant. Good enough to help us plan tonight's operation." The revelation hit Romano like a physical blow. There was only one person it could be: Tony Marino, his right-hand man for the past 6 months. The man who had access to everything, who had helped him plan his most recent operations, who knew all his secrets. Marino, he spat the name like a curse. "He's actually in federal custody right now," Jason continued, turning over everything. "The money laundering operations, the drug routes, the blackmail material you keep in that vault downstairs. But most importantly, he's provided evidence about that night in Chicago. About how you trapped 13 people inside that building before setting it on fire." The other federal agents had begun moving into position, spreading out around the room with practiced efficiency. Romano's security team looked increasingly uncertain, realizing that their usual tactics of violence and intimidation wouldn't work against this level of federal preparation. "But what I don't understand," Romano said, fighting to regain his composure, "is what you're doing here, Mr. Statham. Surely a Hollywood star has better things to do than play cop." Jason's expression remained unchanged, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in seeing justice done. Especially when it comes to men who think they're above the law." Romano's laugh was bitter. "Justice? In my experience, justice is just a word people use when they want revenge." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "Do you have any idea what I've done to people who've crossed me? What I could do to you, federal operation or not?" Jason met his gaze steadily. "That's your problem, Romano. You're still thinking like a thug with a match, not realizing the world has changed around you. Every threat you make, every move you consider, it's all being recorded. Your empire isn't just falling, it's being dismantled piece by piece, with every scrap of evidence documented and preserved." As if to emphasize his point, one of the federal agents placed a small device on the poker table, a sophisticated recording unit that had been capturing everything since the game began. Romano stared at it, understanding dawning on his face. This wasn't just an arrest, it was the culmination of years of careful planning. "The poker game was just a distraction," Jason explained, almost conversationally. "While you were focused on me, federal teams were moving into position throughout your casino. Every computer is being seized, every safe is being opened, and every one of your loyal employees is being offered a chance to cooperate in exchange for leniency." Romano's face had gone pale, but his eyes burned with fury. "You think this changes anything? I have judges in my pocket, politicians on my payroll. By morning, I'll be out on bail and then, Jason cut him off with a sharp laugh. Check your phone if you don't believe me. Try calling any of your usual fixers. The mob boss pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling slightly as he scrolled through his contacts. But with each call attempt, he got the same result: phones that had been disconnected or were already being answered by federal agents. His safety net was evaporating in real time. 30 years of building an empire, Jason said quietly, undone in a single night. Because you never imagined that the son of one of your victims would spend his entire life preparing for this moment. Michael Chen was patient, methodical, and absolutely brilliant. He built this case so thoroughly that not even your pet judges can ignore it. The other players who had remained in the room were watching the exchange with a mixture of fear and fascination. They had all done business with Romano over the years, had all benefited from his criminal enterprise. Now they were witnessing his downfall, orchestrated by an unlikely alliance between a determined federal agent and a Hollywood action star. Why you? Romano asked finally, his voice heavy with defeat. Why did they bring you into this? Jason stood slowly, his presence somehow even more commanding. Because sometimes justice needs a face, Mr. Romano. A story that people will remember and talk about. Your empire wasn't just built on violence. It was built on myth, on the idea that you were untouchable. Breaking that myth required something theatrical. The federal agents moved in closer, handcuffs ready. Romano looked at them, then back at Jason, a final spark of defiance in his eyes. You know what happens to people in my world who cooperate with the feds? Even in prison, my reach is long. But Jason just smiled, and this time it did reach his eyes. That's the beauty of it, he said. Your world doesn't exist anymore. While we've been talking, similar operations have been launched against your allies in Chicago, Miami, and Los Angeles. The evidence Michael gathered implicated your entire network. By morning, there won't be anyone left to carry out your threats. Romano's shoulders sagged as the full weight of his situation finally hit him. 30 years of power and fear, undone by the son of a man he had murdered, with the help of an action star who had turned his private poker game into the stage for his final defeat. The symmetry was almost poetic. As the federal agents moved to make the arrest, Jason picked up his poker chips, $15 million won from a man who had thought himself invincible. The money will be donated to a fund for the families of your victims, he said quietly. It seems fitting that your own pride and greed helped pay for it. The other players were being detained as well, their connections to Romano's organization documented in Michael Chen's exhaustive investigation. They would face their own reckonings with justice, their comfortable lives built on corruption about to crumble around them. But it was Romano who held Jason's attention. The mob boss had aged decades in the past hour, his carefully maintained facade of power shattered beyond repair. As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he looked up at Jason with a mixture of hatred and something close to respect. Tell Chen, tell him he played the game well. Jason nodded once, acknowledging the grudging compliment. He did. But more importantly, he played it right. No innocent lives lost, no collateral damage. Just patience, persistence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. That's what separates men like him from men like you. As Romano was led away, Jason remained at the poker table, looking at the photograph that had started it all. The image of a burning building 30 years ago, and the beginning of a path that had led to this moment. Sometimes, he reflected, the most satisfying victories weren't won with fists or firearms, but with careful planning and the patience to wait for exactly the right moment to act. The news of Vincent Romano's arrest spread through Las Vegas like wildfire. By dawn, the Crimson Palace Casino had been transformed from a monument to criminal power into a crime scene. FBI agents swarmed the building, their evidence teams methodically documenting 3 decades of corruption and violence hidden behind the glamorous facade. Jason Statham stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of Romano's former office, watching the sunrise paint the Vegas Strip in shades of gold and pink. The room still smelled of expensive cigars, but the atmosphere of fear that had permeated the space was gone. On the desk behind him, federal agents were going through Romano's private files, uncovering evidence that would keep prosecutors busy for years. Special Agent Michael Chen had arrived an hour after Romano's arrest, his 6 months of deep cover finally over. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was Tony Marino, the smooth-talking lieutenant, replaced by a focused federal agent with determination etched into every line of his face. Now he stood beside Jason, both men reflecting on the night's events. "I still can't believe we pulled it off," Michael said quietly. "When I started this mission 15 years ago, Romano seemed untouchable. He had judges, politicians, even other federal agents in his pocket. Taking him down seemed impossible." Jason nodded, understanding the weight of the moment. Sometimes the impossible just takes a bit more planning. The operation had been years in the making. Michael had spent his entire career building toward this moment, gathering evidence piece by piece, identifying Romano's weaknesses, and slowly working his way into the organization. But it was his brilliant stroke of bringing Jason into the plan that had finally tipped the scales. "Using me as a distraction was inspired," Jason acknowledged. Romano was so focused on figuring out why a Hollywood star was at his poker table, he never noticed his entire empire being dismantled around him. Michael smiled slightly. That was the point. Romano's greatest weakness was his ego. He couldn't resist the chance to intimidate a celebrity to prove his power. It made him sloppy. Down in the casino's vault, federal agents had discovered decades of blackmail material, photos, documents, and recordings that Romano had used to control politicians and business leaders. But more importantly, they found evidence of his earliest crimes, including detailed records of the Chicago arson that had killed Michael's father and 12 others. "Your father would be proud," Jason said softly, watching his new friend's reflection in the window. Michael's expression tightened with emotion. He was a good man, a community leader who stood up to Romano's extortion. Back then, Romano was just a thug with ambition, but he was already willing to kill to get what he wanted. The sunrise had given way to full morning, the Vegas Strip returning to life as tourists and gamblers began their daily routines, unaware of the historic changes that had occurred overnight. Romano's arrest wasn't just the fall of one mob boss. It was the dismantling of a criminal empire that had influenced every aspect of Vegas life for 3 decades. In the casino below, federal agents were interviewing Romano's employees. Many were innocent of any wrongdoing, simple casino workers who had never known their workplace was the heart of a criminal enterprise. Others were already cooperating, trading information for leniency. The code of silence that had protected Romano for so long was crumbling in the face of federal pressure. "What happens now?" Jason asked, though he already knew the answer. Michael turned from the window, his expression determined. "Now we follow every lead, track down every connection, and make sure none of Romano's organization survives. His associates will try to fill the power vacuum. We need to make sure they fail." The evidence gathered during Michael's undercover operation was damning. Romano hadn't just been involved in traditional mob activities like extortion and gambling. He had diversified into white-collar crime, political corruption, and international money laundering. The investigation would ripple through corporate boardrooms and political offices across the country. "The other families won't take this lying down," Jason observed. "They'll see Romano's fall as an opportunity." Michael nodded grimly. "We're ready for them." This operation wasn't just about Romano, it was about changing the game. The old ways of doing business, the corruption and violence, it all ends here. As if to emphasize his point, another team of federal agents entered the office, carrying boxes of documents from Romano's private residence. The mob boss had been meticulous in recording his criminal enterprise, perhaps believing his power made him immune to prosecution. Now those same records would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. "You know what amazes me?" Michael said, picking up the photograph of the Chicago fire that had started everything. "All those years, all that power, and Romano never figured out who I really was. He murdered my father right in front of me, but he didn't even remember my face." Jason understood the pain behind those words. Men like Romano don't see people as people. They see tools or obstacles. That's why they never suspect someone might be playing a longer game. The longer game had paid off spectacularly. Michael's patience and planning had allowed him to rise through Romano's organization without arousing suspicion. Each step had been calculated, each piece of evidence carefully preserved. When the time came to move against Romano, the case was ironclad. Down in the casino's high roller room, crime scene technicians were still processing the poker table where it had all ended. The cards from the final hand lay exactly as they had fallen, Romano's losing hand facing Jason's royal flush. It seemed almost too perfect, like something from a movie script. "Did you really deal yourself that royal flush?" Jason asked, curiosity finally getting the better of him. Michael's smile was enigmatic. Let's just say that after 30 years of Romano stacking the deck in his favor, it seemed fitting to let him experience what it feels like to lose to a rigged game. The morning wore on, and reports began coming in from other cities. The synchronized raids on Romano's network had been overwhelmingly successful. In Chicago, his drug distribution network was in chaos. In Miami, his money laundering operation had been shut down. In Los Angeles, his political allies were already turning on each other, scrambling to make deals with prosecutors. "You know what the best part is?" Michael said, watching the news coverage on Romano's office television. "He'll live long enough to see everything he built torn down. Every day in prison, he'll hear about another part of his empire being dismantled, another ally turning against him, another secret being exposed." Jason studied his friend's face, seeing not vindictiveness but a deep satisfaction in seeing justice finally served. "Revenge is a dish best served cold," he quoted softly. Michael shook his head. "This isn't about revenge. It's about justice." Revenge would have been putting a bullet in Romano's head 30 years ago. Justice is dismantling his entire world piece by piece, legally and thoroughly, so he can never hurt anyone else. The distinction was important. Michael had spent 15 years of his life pursuing Romano, but he had done it the right way. No laws broken, no shortcuts taken, no innocent people harmed. His patience and dedication had ensured that when Romano finally fell, he fell completely and permanently. As the morning turned to afternoon, Jason prepared to leave. His part in this drama was over, but he knew the work of justice was far from complete. Michael and his team would spend months, perhaps years, following every lead and closing every case that stemmed from this investigation. "Thank you," Michael said as they stood in the casino lobby. "Having you here, helping to orchestrate Romano's final defeat, it meant everything." Jason clasped his hand firmly. "Some roles are worth playing for more than just the camera. What you've done here, the patience and courage it took, that's the real heroic story." Outside, the Vegas sun was bright and merciless, but it felt cleansing somehow. The city would change in the wake of Romano's fall. The corruption that had festered beneath its glittering surface had been exposed to the light. It wouldn't eliminate crime from Vegas, nothing could do that, but it would make the old ways of doing business much harder to maintain. As Jason walked to his car, he reflected on the night's events. He had played many roles in his career, fought many fictional battles on movie sets. But being part of this real-world drama, helping to bring down a criminal empire that had seemed untouchable, was something entirely different. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of heroism happened not in spectacular fights or dramatic confrontations, but in the patient, determined pursuit of justice. The story of how Jason Statham helped bring down Vincent Romano would become Vegas legend, whispered in bars and casinos for years to come. But the real story, the one that would never make headlines, was about a son's devotion to his father's memory and his unwavering commitment to seeing justice done, no matter how long it took. 6 months after the historic poker game that brought down Vincent Romano's criminal empire, Jason Statham returned to Las Vegas. The city had changed subtly but significantly. The Crimson Palace Casino had been sold to legitimate owners, its dark history scrubbed away by extensive renovations and new management. But the real changes ran much deeper than fresh paint and new carpets. The federal investigation sparked by Michael Chen's undercover work had expanded far beyond Romano's immediate organization. The evidence found in the casino's vault had implicated dozens of corrupt officials, leading to a wave of resignations and arrests that reshaped the city's power structure. Vegas was cleaning house, slowly but surely. Jason met Michael at a small diner away from the strip, the kind of place Romano wouldn't have been caught dead in. The federal agent looked different now, more relaxed, as if a great weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The shadow of his father's murder that had driven him for so long had finally begun to fade in the light of justice served. Romano's trial starts next week, Michael said as they settled into their booth. The evidence is overwhelming. His lawyers tried to suppress the recordings from the poker game, claiming entrapment, but the judge shut them down. Turns out even Romano's pet judges weren't willing to risk their careers once the extent of his corruption became public. The case against Romano had only grown stronger in the months since his arrest. His former associates, facing long prison sentences themselves, had turned on him one by one. The myth of loyalty that had protected him for so long had crumbled in the face of federal pressure and the promise of reduced sentences. What about the Chicago case? Jason asked, knowing this was what really mattered to his friend. Michael's expression turned serious. They're charging him with 13 counts of first-degree murder. The evidence we found in his vault, combined with witness testimony from his former enforcers, proves he planned the fire deliberately. He'll finally answer for what he did to my father and the others. The investigation had revealed that the Chicago fire hadn't been Romano's only early atrocity. There were other fires, other murders, stretching back to the beginning of his criminal career. But the Chicago case remained special. It was where he had first revealed the brutal ruthlessness that would define his rise to power. You know what's ironic? Michael continued, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. All those years, Romano kept meticulous records of his crimes, thinking they gave him power over people. He never imagined those same records would be his downfall. Pride really does come before a fall. The ripple effects of Romano's arrest had spread far beyond Las Vegas. Other criminal organizations, seeing how quickly and completely his empire had fallen, were becoming more cautious. The old way of doing business, through violence and intimidation, was becoming too risky in an age of digital evidence and federal surveillance. Some of Romano's former territories are trying to adapt, Michael explained. They're moving into more sophisticated crimes, cybercrime, financial fraud, things that don't leave physical evidence. But we're ready for that too. The task force we created to take down Romano is becoming permanent, focusing on long-term investigations of organized crime. Jason listened, impressed by how thoroughly Michael and his team had thought through the aftermath of Romano's arrest. This hadn't just been about taking down one mob boss, it was about changing the entire ecosystem of organized crime in America. The poker game was the perfect way to end it, Michael reflected. Romano always saw himself as a master player, someone who could read his opponents and control the game. Having him taken down at his own table, in front of his inner circle, destroyed more than just his freedom, it destroyed the myth of his invincibility. They were interrupted by breaking news on the diner's television. Romano's lead attorney had just announced he was pleading guilty to all charges, accepting a plea deal that would ensure he spent the rest of his life in prison. In exchange, he was providing information about decades of unsolved crimes. He's trying to avoid the death penalty for the Chicago murders, Michael explained, watching the announcement with intense focus. But more importantly, he's finally facing what he did. No more denials, no more legal maneuvering. Just the truth after all these years. The guilty plea would save the taxpayers millions in trial costs, but its real value was in the closure it provided to countless victims' families. Romano's testimony would solve dozens of cold cases, allowing relatives to finally know what had happened to their loved ones. What about you? Jason asked quietly. After 30 years of working toward this moment, what comes next? Michael was silent for a long moment, considering the question. There are other Romanos out there, he finally said. Other criminals who think they're untouchable. My father taught me that evil succeeds when good people do nothing. I'm not done doing something about it. The conversation turned to the future of law enforcement in a changing criminal landscape. Michael's successful operation had demonstrated the value of patience and deep undercover work. His methodical approach to gathering evidence and building an airtight case was becoming a model for other federal investigations. You know what Romano asked me last week? Michael said. He wanted to know how long we'd been watching him. When I told him it had been 30 years, that I was the son of the man he murdered in Chicago, he actually laughed. Said he had to admire the dedication. Even in defeat, he sees everything as a game. But it had never been a game to Michael. It had been about justice, about honoring his father's memory by bringing his killer to account through legal means. The fact that Romano could only see it in terms of winning and losing proved he had never understood what really motivated his opponents. As their meeting drew to a close, Jason reflected on his own role in the operation. His presence at the poker game had been more than just a distraction, it had been a symbol of how the world had changed. Romano's old-school criminal empire had been undone by a combination of patient police work and modern surveillance techniques, with a Hollywood action star providing the perfect theatrical finale. "Will you testify at the Chicago trial?" Jason asked as they prepared to leave. Michael nodded firmly. "I need to. Not just for the case, but for myself. I want Romano to look me in the eye when I describe watching him lock those doors and start that fire. I want him to understand that his actions didn't just end lives, they created ripples that eventually led to his own downfall." Outside the diner, the Vegas Strip glittered in the distance, its lights as bright as ever. But the darkness that had lurked beneath its surface, the corrupt foundation that Romano had built his empire upon, was being steadily exposed and dismantled. "Thank you again," Michael said as they parted. "Having you there that night, helping to bring everything full circle, it meant more than you know." Jason clasped his hand warmly. "Sometimes the best roles we play aren't in front of cameras. Sometimes they're just about being in the right place at the right time, helping justice find its way." The story of how a poker game brought down a mob boss would be told and retold in Vegas for years to come. But its true significance lay not in the dramatic confrontation between Jason Statham and Vincent Romano, but in the patient dedication of a son determined to honor his father's memory by pursuing justice the right way. Let us know in the comments if you've ever witnessed justice finally catching up with someone who thought they were above the law. Share this video to remind others that no matter how long it takes, justice finds its way in the end.